G'day and welcome to Cocktails, Controversy and Conservation. I'm Jackie Mumford. It's great to have you here tonight for the last episode of our summer series, brought to you when Chris and I headed out to the Pilliga Forest and along the Darling River at the end of last year. As always, please head along to nature.org.au/donate. It's thanks to generous donors just like you that we're able to get out there across New South Wales and bring you stories from areas, beautiful parts of the state that are affected or threatened in some way. And you can listen to all of these episodes as podcasts now. So next time you have a long drive, head along to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and search for Voices for Nature. And you can hear tonight's episode and all of our previous episodes as a podcast. And we'll be back in 2 weeks' time live. Chris and I will be back when we'll be bringing you a story on koalas. So please join us again in 2 weeks when our summer series is wrapped up and we're back for our full season of cocktails. Tonight's episode is on floodplain harvesting. It's a huge threat to the Darling River and the Menindee Lakes and the whole river system. This issue is going to be hotting up a lot over the coming months as the New South Wales Government considers licensing for floodplain harvesting. You can head along to savemenindeelakes.org.au, which is an NCC-run website on how you can get more involved specifically on the campaign around stopping floodplain harvesting and to save the Menindee Lakes. Tonight's episode we recorded in Broken Hill, where we spoke with Bill Johnson and Maryanne Slattery from Slattery and Johnson about the issue of floodplain harvesting. I hope you get as much out of tonight's episode as I did speaking with them.
So, Maryanne Slattery, Bill Johnson, thanks so much for joining us. Both water experts, writing a report on floodplain harvesting. First and foremost, water, everybody says it's incredibly complex, and maybe it is, but can you give us the sort of for dummies guide? What is floodplain harvesting?
Floodplain harvesting is a method mostly in the Northern Basin,
Where's the Northern Basin? Let's start from that beginning.
So the Murray-Darling Basin is a very large river basin, the Murray River and the Barwon, Darling, Barker rivers. And the Northern Basin is basically, really in essence, the tributaries of the Darling Barker. So the Barwon, Darling, Barker is the main river, and it has 7 or 8 tributaries, and they all feed into it.
So we're talking Burke.
We're talking Burke. Yeah, we're talking Wentworth on the Barker, Wilcannia, Menindee, Burke, Brewarrina, Walgett, and they're all on the Barwon, Darling, Barker. So that's the main stem of the river, and then the rivers that feed into it in a big arc from the Paroo in the west, which comes out of sort of up in central Queensland, the Warrego, the Condamine-Ballons, a big river in Queensland, and then comes into New South Wales. You've got border rivers, Gwydir, Namoi and Macquarie. So there's an arc of catchment from way up, sort of getting to central Queensland, right around to Lithgow. And so all that water falls in that big arc and flows in all that, and it actually meets pretty much in one spot in the area really between near Burke and Walgett. They all come in, and that's the fundamentals of that big river. It's a big river. So unlike the south, which is more regular, the flows are more regular. In the north, there's winter flows from the south, there are monsoon flows in the north. So they're some of the most variable rivers in the world. But the Darling Barker Barwon it takes all of those flows. It takes flows all the year round. And one of the things, a bit of a distraction here, but one of the things is that it never dried up and it rarely stopped flowing because it had big flows from really an enormous part of the basin. So it's highly variable. There are main river channels, but there are thousands of smaller channels. Some are only marginally smaller, but thousands of smaller channels. The floodplains are not just a single river channel with a flat table, like a table. They are intersecting streams, and they break out, they break back, and it's an enormous network of intersecting streams and braidage systems. And so the Lower Balonne floodplain, for example, is about 2 million hectares, and that's just one of the rivers, so it's vast. So carries a lot of water, and there aren't as many big headwater storages in the upper catchment as in the south. A lot of the water flows through these streams, and there's an enormous opportunity which has been taken to harvest off those floodplains. And it's not just taking water that never goes back to the river, which you hear, but that water, it breaks out, it goes into wetlands and swamps, and they all come back. And in the end, all of that water would have come back is in this big river that then flows 1,500 k's through the semi-arid arid area and joins the Murray. It's a big river. So floodplain harvesting is the taking of water that flows across the floodplain and streams away from the main channels.
Which then obviously impacts on what happens further down the channel. There's just less water.
Yeah,
They've intercepted it.
They've intercepted it, that's right, yeah.
And when you say, the river, it very rarely did ever run dry, what's the time period that we're talking about? Like how long has it, when did it start to sort of, because on our travels we've seen it sort of various places in Wilcannia, the river was almost completely dry, and we know that there are, like long periods recently where it has been dry. When did that sort of start, and is that, what can you attribute that to?
It's the evidence that the river, so we've been talking to fisheries ecologists, people who've been looking at the old riverboat records, we look at the river channel itself, so the evidence is there through the fish and mussels that they're flowing water, they need flowing water habitat. And so, and the river itself, that big channel, there's a lot of power in that channel that comes from flow. The water gives it the power, and that's the power in that river that means that there's the ecologists and the researchers are saying it never dried up, and it rarely stopped flowing. Maybe 90% of the time it flowed, but even in the worst of the historic droughts, there were big flows, big full channel flows quite frequently. Now, the big sudden change, so this is over thousands of years, that channel doesn't form overnight, thousands and thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years, it's been a really sudden drop in the last 20 years. It's just the last 20 years has been a sudden drop.
And does that coincide with floodplain harvesting, or what are you seeing?
Yeah,
I think there's little doubt we've had a massive growth in floodplain harvesting. It hasn't been limited by the legal limits that governments have put in place and agreed that we would limit take to 1994 level of development. The growth and the ability to capture floodplain harvesting and putting levee banks and structures in place to capture and funnel floodplain harvesting has just been increasing. And it just makes sense. You take more water from upstream, there's less water downstream. And that's what we're seeing. Yeah.
It's coincided with a move into drier conditions, but the fact that the river has had so little flow for the last 20 years cannot be accounted for simply by that.
And that's borne out by research that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority itself has done, that this change cannot be attributed only to climate variability, that there is a factor of growth in extractions.
Yeah. Tell us about the report that you're currently working on, and what are you finding?
Sure. So the New South Wales Government is in the process of issuing floodplain licences. It's been sort of 20 plus years in the making. The practice is currently unlicensed, unregulated, and that also means unmeasured and unmonitored. It's great that they're moving towards licensing floodplain harvesting. But the real issue is that under law they're required to limit take to the 1994 level of development. So that's the infrastructure that was in place in 1994 and the rules that were in place in 1994. And while they're undertaking what they tell us is a very rigorous process to issue these licences, what they cannot demonstrate is that licences are going to be reduced back to the 1994 level of development. So we've been asking for several years, and what is the evidence to demonstrate this? We've been saying that the onus is on government to demonstrate that we're back at 1994 levels. No reassurances were coming forth, no promises of any evidence was coming forth. So we undertook the process ourselves to figure out what was the 1994 level of development. And that's what we've done. We've gone back and looked at on-farm storages at points in time since 1994 up to the present. And we've also collated, we've done that through satellite imaging and LiDAR, and we've also collated 25 years worth of the literature and research around estimates of floodplain harvesting and on-farm storages.
And so when you talk about floodplain harvesting and the amount of take and licensing, can you just talk us through what that actually looks like on farms? Like where do they take the water and how is it stored and how do they capture it?
So a lot of irrigation properties have big storages. They call them on-farm storages or reservoirs, and they're on a flat landscape, so the earth is dug out from most on the inside and built up and big banks, and the water is put into them. Now they are the centrepiece. They're the storages. They call the on-farm storages or the on-farm reservoirs where water that is harvested is stored. Now, associated with that is a whole lot of harvesting and collecting infrastructure. So it's banks, it's levees, it's channels, it's diversions, and so properties are set up and they're on floodplains and they've got a lot of streams associated with them. And so when the water flows across the landscape or out of the main rivers or on creeks across the landscape and breaks out in many of the runners, then it is often intercepted by those ancillary banks and levees and impoundments, and then either gravity fed or pumped into these big storages. And there are different methods. There's a method that's used in Queensland, often and some in New South Wales, where there are a small levee or a weir is put across a stream, and that holds the water up, and a channel can be dug from the stream into a storage. So the weir will hold the water up at a certain level, which then diverts it into the storage. So gravity, people say there's a bit of a saying, oh, we work with nature, we use gravity. So that's one of the justifications, or one of the ways it's explained. So the storages that we've mapped are the centrepiece, but there is enormous ancillary infrastructure around it that can divert and manage and hold water, and it can be held temporarily. It can be moved around. So it's a very sophisticated and effective way of intercepting flows.
Just recently, in the New South Wales Upper House, there's been a fair bit of controversy around, first of all, the disallowance, and now an attempt to pass through the Parliament some changes around floodplain harvesting. Can you just explain what that all is and what that means?
Sure. So floodplain harvesting has been an allowed practice, forever. But under the New South Wales legislation, you cannot take any water without a licence. The last floodplain harvesting event we had before this year was in 2016. In 2017 or 18, the New South Wales created a natural resource access regulator, which was to regulate all aspects of water compliance after a whole lot of scandals around water and the mismanagement of water had emerged through different media outlets. So the Natural Resource Access Regulator, NRA, the first time they had an opportunity to really be faced with the prospect of people taking water off the floodplain without a licence was at the beginning of this year. There was a large amount of rain forecast in the Northern Basin in February this year, and NRA advised a group of senior bureaucrats and irrigators that floodplain harvesting without a licence, so that means anyone that takes floodplain harvesting in New South Wales is illegal, and they would prosecute if people took water. So the Minister and the Department rushed through a regulation to exempt the need to have a licence to take floodplain water.
And when you say rush through, this was literally 24 hours before it started raining.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
It seems as though from documents we've received through the upper house, or Helen Dalton requested in the upper house, it was a very rushed decision and a rushed regulation. That because of, you've got a certain number of sitting days to put forward a disallowance motion and vote on a disallowance motion. Because of COVID, that the ability to vote on that stretched out for months because Parliament wasn't sitting. So it was before Parliament in about August, I think, this year, and it was disallowed.
The disallowance motion was before Parliament?
Yes, yeah. And it was disallowed, and Labor and all the crossbenchers, with the exception of Fred Nile, supported the disallowance motion. So it was pretty comprehensive rejection of it. The last Parliament sitting, which was a couple of weeks ago, Minister Pavey put up a rescission to reverse the disallowance motion. That was defeated a couple of nights ago in Parliament by an increased majority than the disallowance motion. Minister Pavey has now said that she's going to resubmit the regulation on the 22nd of January next year. There's a certain number of days that lapse after you put up a failed regulation that you can put up another one. So she's putting up the new regulation to the day that she's allowed to, and that will be before Parliament is sitting. So it'll again be subject to a disallowance, but there'll be at least a few weeks opportunity for floodplain harvesting if there's water before it goes before Parliament and is disallowed. So they're pretty desperate to get it through.
Yep.
At the same time, the government and some parts of the irrigation sector in the north are at pains to say floodplain harvesting is not illegal. It's just ambiguous, but they cannot tell us why it's ambiguous, and they haven't been able to refute some very clear legal advice that, take without a licence is illegal.
What's the sort of, I know your report's not finished, but you've now crunched a lot of data, and I know we're going to see a presentation later tonight, but what's the sort of big takeout, and what do you think the message from your research so far is for government in particular and other stakeholders?
Well, the cap is a legal requirement under Commonwealth and New South Wales legislation that we limit take to 1994 level of development. It is up to government to prove that it's been the case. They haven't provided any evidence. They won't say they're going to provide any evidence. We have evidence. It's very clear that there's been a growth of more than 140% in on-farm storages in the northern New South Wales basin. So government has to, say how they're going to deal with that.
So what do you think are the implications for cap of that?
Well, if you've got the south mostly compliant with cap, and the north not compliant with cap, certainly in relation to floodplain harvesting, it really begs the question of, is there a cap? And the government, when they introduced cap, said there was an equity issue. Everyone has to be under cap, otherwise, some parties, benefit while others suffer. It's worth noting that the amount of floodplain harvesting that the New South Wales Government is proposing on a maximum annual basis is around about 2,100 gigalitres, which is the total amount of water recovery under the Basin Plan. And 85% of the water recovery has come out of the south, while the north, where you've got this big growth, has been able to expand, and they now have what looks like as much floodplain harvesting as the total water recovered. So, environment suffers, but just from our community perspective, it's a massive equity issue.
When the report's available, can we direct people to see a copy of it, or will it be published online or something like that?
We've been doing this, we're engaged in this by a large group of people. Southern Riverine Irrigators, the Inland Rivers Network supported it, the Darrow Elders group at Walgett's has supported it. So the Broken Hill Outdoor Recreation Hunting Club supported it. So there's some councils supported it. So it will be really up to them to to do that. But I think people seem very keen for it to be public. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And Inland Rivers Network is a member group of NCC, so I'm sure we can get our hands on a copy through there.
Yeah, so the Inland Rivers has been a strong supporter. Yeah.
Thanks so much for joining us. We're looking forward to the show tonight.
Yeah.
Thanks, yeah.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Maryanne.